Welcome everyone. Actually, I'm quite taken aback that we have the numbers we do for such an extremely esoteric and fine-tuned book by our author today, Mr. Ranjit Chaudhri. It's a very strange alignment that took place for us to think of doing this for the book club. And we have the usual suspects from the Bengal Club book club here, as most of you who are our supporters and friends would know. It gives me enormous pleasure and it's a great honor to have Ranjit here today. We've just, all of us, we were just chatting and saying we've just finished a play called Happy Birthday Shakespeare, and what you see here is a set of people who've lived and breathed together for several hours a day for the last 1 month doing that play. And what struck us all about Ranjit was the calm and the unflustered personality that he is. Such a wonderful Hamlet that he played with his understated anger. So what I want to also tell you is, for me, it was kind of strange because when we were deciding on a date, we first thought we'd have it a few days earlier. And then quite rightly, Ranjit pointed out to us, Harish and I was sitting with him upstairs, he said, why don't we do it on the 21st of June? And all the lights went off in my head because today is my mother's 5th death anniversary. And what better than the kind of person that she was, the calmness that she, induced in other people as well as a doctor. And I very quietly and rightly said yes. Today also happens to be, as Ranjit pointed out to me, International Day of Yoga. So welcome to you all on behalf of the Bengal Club and the Library Subcommittee, which runs our book clubs. It's an unusual book for us to be unpackaging together with you. The reason is we select one and only one spiritual or a book such as this. We started nearly 5 years ago during the COVID and before with a book called Peter Matheson's The Snow Leopard, which is the spiritual journey inside and out. Then we did Pico Iyer's book on stillness and Buddhism. This book really fell into our lap because of getting to know Ranjit, and as a member of this club we thought how fantastic that he is a best-selling author. Well known for his accessible translations. It was the Shiva Sutra that was hugely popular and became a national bestseller, as well, I think, as 112 Meditations. This book, I think, for me is very special. It's my mother's connection that spoke to me when I read that Ramakrishna Paramahansa Dev used to talk about consciousness. For instance, this story is in his book. And I was surprised because this is a story we grew up on. When we talked in the morning over cups of tea on Sundays, though we were sent to English convent schools, there was a huge effort on my parents' part to kick us on the track of our culture. Ramakrishna Paramahansa Dev used to say, what is consciousness? Where is it coming from? The story goes that when he used to feed Ma Kali at Dakshineshwar. It was the sweets that were the conscious spirit carriers. It was the water vessel. It was the altar. It was Ma Kali. It was the devotee himself. Even the marble floor was part of that consciousness. This is in Ranjit's book. Now, without further ado, we are hoping that each of us can pick up one of the sutras and speak about it. The way we usually do these discussions, we want you to be actively involved. So we do a round robin after the author has spoken, and then we open it up to the floor. Welcome to stay as long as you want, and of course at the end of it, there is an opportunity to get your books signed by the author. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for coming. Such a special book discussion. I hand over the floor to the author, Mr. Ranjit Chaudhri. Yes.
Thank you, Julie, and the rest of the book club. Harish, Chitali, Anusuya, and Anju. Thank you all for being here. It's a very special day actually to launch a yoga book, being the International Day of Yoga. And it's also a full moon day. In ancient times, we used to have holidays on full moon and new moon days because those were days that your energy naturally used to rise. And there were many masters who got enlightened on a full moon day. Buddha was one of them. He got enlightened on a full moon day in May, which we now call as Buddha Purnima. One of India's, you hear a lot of talk about how today yoga is one of India's biggest gifts to the world, which is true. And it's not just yoga, it's our entire spiritual heritage. When our country got invaded, the invaders used to they took a lot of our gold away. Some took our diamond away, some took the peacock's one away. But the real treasure was our spiritual heritage. It wasn't in those precious metals. The actual treasure was here. Because there's one thing that's special about our country. There are other countries that have produced more Nobel Prize winners, more Olympic gold medalists, more PhDs. But there's something that we've produced where no country even comes a close second. And that is, we produce a maximum number of enlightened people that have walked this planet. We've produced a Krishna, a Buddha, a Ram, a Mahavira. And even when we were under occupation, these enlightened people kept popping up. There was a Guru Nanak, who was there at the time of Babur. There was Kabir. Later there was Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Ramana Maharishi, Paramahansa Yogananda, and so many others. The list just goes on. And amongst our spiritual texts, this is one of our iconic texts, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. There are others like the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Ashtavakra Gita. There are a few of them which are timeless classics. And they're important because their wisdom was not just for a particular time, it was there for all time. Now, this sutras is just 196 sutras, and a sutra is something like an equation or a formula. You've got to expand on it, you've got to open up on it. It's written in brief, and one has to explain it. And Patanjali speaks to us at 3 or 4 levels. This is a book that's mainly tells you how to be enlightened, but he also tells you how to control your mind, which is the cause of a lot of our suffering and is also key to enlightenment. He also tells you why we suffer, what are the causes of suffering, what are the internal causes, what are the external causes, and he explains how life works. What is the law of karma? How are we attracting karma? And how does that shape us as a person? And how can we drop karma from our lives? How can we get rid of it? We don't want it to be a glue that sticks to us. We want it to be something that drops off so that we don't have to keep going through endless rounds of suffering. Now, somebody may ask, why bother learning all this? Somebody asked this question to Nisargadatta Maharaj, who was an enlightened yogi in the 1980s. He wrote a book called Who Am I? And he says, well, the search for the self is important. If you don't do it, your life is nothing but trouble. If you want to live sanely, creatively, and peacefully, you need to search for yourself. Um, Sometimes when we are stressed, things are going wrong in our life. What does it mean? It means that we don't have control over our mind. Our mind is our own faculty, but we've lost control of it, and it keeps worrying and it starts driving us crazy. So, what do people normally do? Sometimes it used to be a habit, probably still is, where after work, people would come and have a drink or have two drinks just to relax and calm themselves down. There are others who take to drugs. But those are not suitable methods to control your mind because they harm your body. Now, if you have a supercomputer and the mind is more than a supercomputer, you don't try and destroy it by feeding it a virus. You learn the manual, you learn the user's manual of how to use the mind. And Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is one of the best user's manual for the mind you'll ever find. Even though it was written so many centuries ago, he's so comprehensive and detailed in the way he goes about how the mind functions, how you need to control it. Now, lately we've been having or some countries that have legalized drugs, which is really a very dangerous development because it leads to permanent damage of the mind. And there was an enlightened yogi of India who taught this lesson to a Harvard professor, that how useless these drugs are. There was a Harvard professor of psychology in the 1960s called Dr. Richard Alpert. And he was a professor of psychology and he was doing very well. He had a Mercedes-Benz car, he had a private sailboat, he had a Cessna aeroplane. He had everything in life. He was a visiting professor of Stanford and MIT. And he somehow felt that there was something missing. He felt that psychology did not capture the entire human condition and didn't explain it fully. Now, in the 1960s, was these psychedelic drugs, especially LSD, started becoming popular. And he, along with students of Harvard, they started experimenting with it. And LSD used to give you a high, and then when you went off it just brought you crashing down. So he wanted to search for a holy man in India who he felt might give him that answer. Maybe there's a missing link to keep yourself permanently high while using these drugs. So he came to India, and by chance, through another American, he went and he met Neem Karoli Baba, who was an enlightened yogi who had his ashram near Nainital. And the first day when he met Neem Karoli Baba told him, "You thought of your mother last night, and she died a year ago of a spleen." He pointed here, was disorder. And Richard Alpert was shocked. He says, "How can this man even know that my mother had died a year ago?" And the next day, when he goes to meet Neem Karoli Baba, he calls him, he says, "You've got questions, come." And before Richard Alpert could say anything, he says, "Show me your medicine." He referred to his LSD as a medicine. He put his palm out. And Richard Alpert put one pill in there. He still kept his palm out. He put a second pill. He still kept his palm out. He put a third pill. Now he swallowed the entire 3 pills, and which is a very potent dose. And Richard Alpert looked very anxiously. He said, "It's a dose that could kill someone." And it had no effect on Neem Karoli Baba. It had 0 effect on him. And he was trying to give him a message that these drugs are useless. Don't waste your time with them. And Richard Alpert stayed in his ashram for a few months. He learned yoga, and he was taught this particular text, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. He changed his name to Ram Das, and he returned to America and wrote a best-selling book called Be Here Now. And before he left, Neem Karoli Baba touched him 3 times on his forehead, and he sort of opened him up. I described that experience in the book, and he was in an exalted state for a while, and then he went back to America and he taught yoga. And there were others who came to that ashram because of him, a very young Steve Jobs later on, Julia Roberts, and later on Mark Zuckerberg. But coming back to Patanjali, today a lot of people, sometimes when I ask somebody, they say, Patanjali, is that Ramdev? I said, no, that's not Ramdev. Ramdev and other yoga institutes, they use the name of Patanjali to try and show that they're following Patanjali's teachings. But Patanjali was a sage who, as per scholars, he lived either between the 2nd and 5th century BC, or he lived 9th to 10th century BC. He lived a very long time ago. And there's an interesting legend about his birth, a myth, where Adishesha, the king of serpents, went to Lord Shiva. And Lord Shiva blessed Adishesha and said that you're going to take birth as a human. At the same time, there was a pious lady called Gonika who was praying to Lord Shiva with her hands open, palm facing upwards, praying for a son. And Adishesha fell into her palms. And he was given the name Patanjali. Patanjali is made up of two words, Pat, which means to fall down, and Anjali, which means to have your hands together with your palm upwards. He is also known as Gonika Putra because he was son of Gonika. And that's, of course, a story about him. What we do know was that he authored 2 other books, one on medicine, one on grammar. And he said in the introduction to his book on grammar that he lived in Kashmir for a while. He also consecrated the linga at the Chidambaram temple in Tamil Nadu. We don't know whether he was a Kashmiri or Tamil or something else. We don't have that information on him. But he left us his Yoga Sutras. And he's very direct and to the point. He doesn't waste a single word. And he starts in the 2nd sutra, he says, stilling the activities of the mind is yoga. And he says when you do that, the seer abides in his own nature, which means that you're enlightened when you are able to still the activities of the mind. Then he goes into further detail. And he says if you don't still the activities of the mind, you'll be identified with them. Now he goes into further detail. He says that there are 5 activities of the mind. They are right beliefs, wrong beliefs, sleep, imagination, and memory. These are the 5 basic activities of the mind. Now when we face a problem with the mind and we are getting stressed, it's basically our memory and our imagination that goes crazy. We don't have control over these 2 things. That's what goes out of control. He says some of these activities can be painful or they can be pain-free. And Patanjali he's known as the father of yoga. He was not the founder of yoga. Lord Shiva was the founder of yoga. But what he was known for was he organized yoga into 8 limbs. And 8 different parts or 8 different limbs. He organized it into these 8 limbs. And he discusses these 8 limbs in the 2nd chapter. But before he goes to that, he talks about his whole process is how do you control the mind. And before he gets to the 8 limbs, there are a few things that he repeats from time to time. One is he talks about service. He mentions that a few times. He mentions it maybe 3 times, that service will take you all the way. And service doesn't necessarily mean that you give up your job and you start doing social work. It's the attitude that you bring to your job, that you want to serve others, you want to do something of benefit, and you want to help others. So he repeats this a few times. The second thing he talks about is continuous practice and detachment. And that's something that even Lord Krishna mentions in the Bhagavad Gita about continuous practice and detachment. And detachment here is towards sensory objects or sensory pleasures. The point being that if you're always hankering over pleasures of the body, whether it's food, whether it's sex, and you're always thinking about them, it gets tougher to control the mind. So they talk about detachment in the sense that you're detaching from being addicted to sensory pleasures. And Lord Krishna says the same thing in the Bhagavad Gita, and surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, both Lord Krishna and Patanjali, they use the same words. Abhyasa for continuous practice and Vairagya for detachment. A third method that he gives, which he says that if you're suffering and you're in despair, and he talks about certain physical ailments you may have, shortness of breath, trembling of the bodies, all these things may refer to hypertension or Parkinson's or diabetes. Now, he says that there's a sound that represents God, and that sound is the mantra Am, A-U-M. You would have heard a variation of it as Om, O-M, but the actual mantra is A-U-M, and he says this sound represents God. And by chanting it, you become one with God. And if you're suffering and you're in despair, you can come out of it just by chanting this one mantra. Now, there are similarities with this to other religions. In Christianity, there's a passage in the Bible that's sometimes not understood clearly, where it says, first came the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, a word is a sound. And after their prayers, the Christians say, Amen. If you ask an American, they'll say Amen. But if you look at the way the Vatican, when they say Amen, they say Amen. So they basically almost sing the mantra plus adding an end to it. And for this mantra, the reason it's a little different is there are only 3 sounds we can make without moving our tongue. If we open our mouth and we say a sound, it'll be it'll just be A continuously. And if we start closing the mouth, when it's semi-closed, that A sound becomes U, U. And then when we close the mouth fully, it's M. So that's your basic mantra. All you have to do is you open your mouth, and while breathing out, you see the sound and you start closing your mouth, and you automatically sing the mantra. And so he gives these simple things, which you just have to, you don't have to go through the whole 8 parts or all 8 of them. You can just do one mantra, and that's sufficient for you. He makes it, that simple. Now he also gives a lot of practical advice on the way. Like he says, there are only 4 types of people you will meet. Now, you may think that we meet many types. You have people of different nationalities, American, British, Europeans, Chinese, Africans, there are all kinds of people. He says, no, there are only 4 categories of people. You'll have someone who's happy. You'll have someone who's unhappy or who's suffering. Third, you'll have someone who's virtuous. And fourth, you'll have someone who's wicked. Now he explains how you should be with each of these 4 types of people so that you're calm and peaceful, that you don't get disturbed. Now, and incidentally, all of us at any given point of time are in one or more of these categories. Now, interacting with somebody who's happy or joyful or virtuous is easy. You're friendly towards them, you're joyful towards them. He says someone who's unhappy or suffering, you have to be compassionate. Karuna, it's a term that was also used a lot later in Buddhism. You have to show compassion to them. And this is also true of your own family members. There may be some of them who are suffering, who have some issue. Instead of being irritated with them, one has to show compassion towards them. And the fourth one is someone who's wicked. It may not be someone who's downright evil. There may be someone who's done something to you or done something that's not good to you. So for these people, he says you should be disregarding or overlooking. Now, what he's trying to say is that you disregard or overlook their faults. Normally what we do is we keep thinking about them. And that thought is what makes us unhappy and drives us crazy. There was a Greek philosopher who came later on who explained this concept in much greater detail. He was a person called Epictetus, who lived on the 1st century AD, and he founded a philosophy called Stoicism. And he was very popular with the American prisoners of war in Vietnam, who were being tortured. And what Epictetus said was the same thing that Patanjali said in one sutra. He said that it's not the act itself that causes suffering. It's the thought about it that causes suffering. If you remove the thought, you are at peace. So when somebody does something wrong to you, it's not that you don't take action. You have to protect yourself, you may have to take action. But you don't keep thinking about it, because that's where the suffering comes from. Uh, that's what he says about these four different types of people. And he goes on to say that they are basically five afflictions that cause you suffering. These kleshas that he calls them. The first is ignorance, the second is egoism, attraction, aversion, and tenacity of mundane experience. And he says ignorance is your key. That causes all the other afflictions. He says your ignorance is of many kinds. One is you think what is pleasure is actually pain. And he's hinting that you're going after bodily pleasures, but there's something much higher. Compared to the pleasures of the soul, your bodily pleasures is actually pain. And he says you're mixing up what you think is eternal is actually transient. And he also says that what you think is what is actually the non-self, you're confusing that with the self. And that's the second affliction, which is the ego. He says you're identifying with your mind and your body, which are actually instruments of your soul. That's not who you really are, but you identify with your body. You identify with your mind, what we call the ego, and he says that's not who you are, and that's the second affliction, and that these two are the most important. Now, when you identify with your body, you get influenced by pleasure, you get influenced by pain. And that's what attraction and aversion is. You're influenced by pleasure, you're influenced by pain. And the other thing is tenacity of mundane existence. We're used to living the way we are. Sometimes to live in a conscious way, to live in awareness instead of living in our mind all the time, you have to make that effort, you have to make that jump. And sometimes old habits bring us down. In the book, I'd given an example of Swami Vivekananda when he met Ramakrishna for the second time. That time he was known as Narendranath. Ramakrishna touched him with his feet. He was sitting at the foot of Ramakrishna's bed, and Ramakrishna touched him with his feet. And suddenly he felt the whole world disappearing. He found the walls of the room collapsing. He found that the floors sinking, and he thought he was going into a void. And he cried out to Ramakrishna, "What are you doing? Don't you know I have a family?" And Ramakrishna laughed. He said, "Okay, it doesn't have to happen so fast." So he touched him on his chest with his hand, and the whole world came back again to normal. And Swami Vivekananda then decided, he was later upset with himself. He says, why did I do this? Next time he was determined that when something like this happens, I'm going to go through this and experience it. Now, what Patanjali says is, he says the origins of yoga, of karma, the storehouse of karma has its roots in these afflictions. It's because of this, and because of having an ego, and because of being ignorant, that we have karma that affects us. And karma is basically of three kinds. There's a storehouse of karma that we have, each individual has. Out of that karma, we've allotted a particular amount that we exhaust in this lifetime. And there's new karma that we pick up through our actions in this lifetime. And the kind of person we are, our nature, our characteristics, our qualities, he mentions this later, it's determined by our karmic impressions. And he says your actions has certain consequences, and as a result of the consequences, these consequences may arise, the fruits of your actions, they may arise in this life and future lives. And your future life, your time span, the kind of person you are, the experiences you have, some of those experiences you have, depend on the karma that you have. And he also says the kind of person you're born as also depends on some of your unfulfilled desires. If there's something you want to achieve, for example, say you want to be a great tennis player, you'll be born with those qualities so that you can fulfill that desire. That's one of the things he says later on in the book. And then he goes on to say that if you're a keen observer, you'll notice that it's all suffering. And what he's saying is very similar to what Buddha said after he was enlightened. In his first sermon near Benares, he gave the four noble truths. And the first of those noble truths was life is suffering. But what both Patanjali and Buddha said, they were not negative people. They said there's a way out of it. You can live joyful lives. You don't have to live a life of suffering. And Patanjali says that there are three external factors that come, one that may cause suffering to you. One is changing circumstances. Something goes wrong in your life. It could be a health problem, could be anything. That's one thing that go wrong. Second, due to your past karma, there are certain experiences come up that you don't desire. And third, he says there are inherent contradictions in the functioning of nature, the way it functions. There are contradictions in them. And what he's trying to say is that it's not all, we always want pleasure, we want to avoid pain. Life doesn't work like that. And he mentions right in the end of the book, almost the very last sutras, that there's a process of evolution. Things are happening in your lives to help you evolve. And you won't understand why it's happening till you're at the end of your journey. At that stage, you look back and you'll understand, okay, this is why something happened to me. So then he asks, what is the way out of this? How do you remove ignorance? And he mentions a statement. He goes on to say that in the absence of ignorance, you are always, he says, if you remove ignorance, you become one with the Creator, you become one with God. And in the absence of ignorance, you are always one with God. So it's a very non-dualistic way of looking at things, that we are always one with God. Ignorance arises, so we feel separate. We remove ignorance, and once again we get enlightened. Now, how do you remove ignorance? He says you need discriminating perception. You have to enhance your perception to a level where it's discriminating. And how do you do that? How do you get to that level of perception that's discriminating? You practice the 8 limbs of yoga. And discriminating perception is, you wonder sometimes some of the temples, they have snakes in them. Or you see Lord Shiva with a snake. And what's the symbolism behind a snake? There are creatures you don't want to be around. A snake has a very, very enhanced level of perception. They can't see, but their perception is very high. And when somebody's enlightened, invariably, they can sense it. A snake may show up. Now, he gives 8 limbs of yoga, and I'll go through them very briefly. The first were self-disciplines. There are 5 of them. And the first one is non-violence, ahimsa, which you would have heard a lot from Mahatma Gandhi, who really practiced it. And ahimsa really means non-injury, that you don't harm any person, either emotionally or physically. And he goes to say later in the book that if you're disturbed by certain thoughts, he said, think of their opposite. Because those thoughts that may arise out of anger or greed or delusion, and you act on them, and you harm someone else, it's going to cause you endless suffering. So at the level of thought, change it. Before you act on it, change the thought. Think of its opposite, so that you don't ever get to a stage that you're acting on a thought based on anger or greed or delusion. He also says that a person who's established in non-violence, it has an effect on people around him. In his presence, other people become peaceful. And in the book I gave the example of Mahatma Gandhi when he went to Noakholi in East Bengal in 1946, just before, when there was severe rioting. The minorities, Hindus were getting killed over there. And he went and he spoke to people, and just his presence there, he walked from village to village, it had a tremendous effect. So he was one person who really put into practice what Patanjali says. The second of the self-disciplines is truthfulness. The third is asteya, not stealing. The fourth is brahmacharya, which most people think is celibacy, but it's not. Brahmacharya is made of 2 words, Brahman, which means God, and Charya, which means to be on the path of. So Brahmacharya means that you're on the path of God. It doesn't mean you can be celibate, you may not be celibate, that's a choice given to you. The fifth and last self-discipline, the yama, is a parigraha. It's one that's not talked about much, but it's very relevant to our times today. A parigraha means not having unnecessary possessions. Today there's a lot of focus on the environment and how people are trying to save the environment, and we're talking about solar power and battery cars. But the main cause of actually an environment is that every time you consume something or you buy something, to manufacture something requires energy and resources. It always has some effect on the planet. Now, if you consume more and you're buying more, especially things you don't need, then that obviously has an adverse effect on the environment. Now, after the yamas, the self-disciplines, and he says that these self-disciplines are for all time. These are the great vows and they're there for all time. And after this, you have the 5 observances, which are more personal in nature. The self-disciplines are more outgoing. The observances are more inward. They're more about your personal conduct, like cleanliness, contentment, practice of austerities. And the most important of these is, again, service, which he says is sufficient to take you all the way. Next, you have the asanas and pranayams, which is what yoga is famous for. He doesn't talk about specific asanas and pranayams because those were things that you had to learn from a teacher. But the basic reason, that's one of the reasons why yoga is so famous today, because of the effect of asanas and pranayams. It has such an effect on the body. Now, the main theory in yoga is that when you're trying to progress spiritually, you don't want your body to be an impediment. So these asanas and pranayams kept your body healthy. They gave you a stable platform from which you could evolve and you could move ahead in your spiritual evolution. And they will also increase your energy levels, because once your energy goes up, then it's easier for you to be conscious, easier for you to be in a state of awareness when your energy levels are high. And some of these pranayams, if you do, I don't know how the yogis actually discover them. They're different ratios you breathe in. They affect different organs of your body. They improve the health of your lungs, your heart, your liver, your stomach, your kidneys. And they used to combine these pranayams with hand movements, mudras. We call them mudras, or they're just gestures. If you have your hands like this, you will alter the flow of breath in your body. You change the mudra like this, it again alters. The different mudras, they'll alter the flow of your body, and depending on what they mix these with different pranayams, and the whole effect on the body is to really revitalize it. After pranayam, you come to the 5th limb of yoga, which is pratyahar. It's sensory detachment. He talks about it earlier. He says you have to detach your sense organs from their objects so that you're not addicted to sensory pleasures. Now, say somebody is abusing you. If you detach your ear from the sound, then that abuse will not affect you. Normally, we will react. Any normal person will react to that abuse and want to abuse back or strike back. But if you have that awareness and you practice that detachment of sensory stimuli, you won't let that affect you. And that's pratyahara. And he says when you reach pratyahara, then your sensory detachment, then your mind is more stable and it's fit for concentration and meditation. And the 6th limb is concentration. He says it means concentrating on a particular object and or place. And there'll be breaks in your concentration. When your concentration is flowing evenly, you progress to meditation, which is the next level. You're able to concentrate for greater lengths of time without a break on an object, so that becomes meditation. And finally, the next step is samadhi. It's the 8th limb of yoga, and that's the 8th and final limb of yoga. And in samadhi, he says your mind is so still, it's like a pure crystal. So if you put a pure crystal next to an object, it will reflect the light of that crystal. In the same way, samadhi is when you're meditating on an object, it seems that only the object is there and you're not there. The mind is that still. And he said in the state of samadhi, all your karmas get dissolved. And you also, he says your supreme self shines, your soul shines. And he says the wisdom you get in that state is of a different realm. It's of a different level compared to anything you hear from scriptures. Now, in our time, where in our world increasingly there's religious strife, and religions fight with each other, and members of one religion would say, my holy book is better than yours. Here's a person who says the highest wisdom is of your soul. It's of a completely different level compared to anything that you're going to read in a scripture. And you can access this on a daily basis. It's not just when you reach samadhi. Sometimes when you need to take a great decision in your life, they always say you should be out of your mind. You try and access the wisdom of your soul so that you get an idea or you get an insight into the next best step that you take. And samadhi is not final liberation. There's one step left, which he says in the end, and he talks about some of he says when you practice these last three limbs together, which is concentration, meditation, samadhi, he calls it samyama. And samyama, he devotes most of a chapter onto some of the spiritual powers that you get. And you do that by practicing samyama. When you're concentrating deeply on something, that object or that phenomena will open up and give you all its knowledge. And that's the basic theory behind how the yogis used to get their knowledge. Now, the last book I'd done was a book called Spanda Karikas. It was written by a sage called Vasugupta from Kashmir in the 8th century. The Shiva Sutras were revealed to him, and in the Spanda Karikas he says that God is consciousness, and consciousness isn't everything. And he says consciousness has a vibration in it. It's not inert, it's got an energy, it's got a pulse, it's got a dynamism in it. And he says this vibration quality of consciousness, you find it all over, in the whole world. Now you can think that you look at the stable is still. Where's there vibration in it? But if you look at any matter on a subatomic level, it's made up of protons and neutrons, which form a nucleus, and there's an electron that's rotating around it. Now the protons and neutrons themselves are made up of further particles called quarks, antiquarks, gluons, which are constantly in motion. And most of what we know about physics on these subatomic particles was really discovered in the 20th century, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. Now here you have a sage in the 8th century talking about it. The only way he got that information is how the yogis did. They did samyama, they focused deeply onto something. In the same chapter, what the other thing that Patanjali talks about is divine intuition, that if you have divine intuition, if you have that link with God, you have access to all information. And one example of this was the famous Indian mathematician Ramanujan, who was basically uneducated, but he produced some amazing formulas in his life. He produced a total of 3,900 formulas. And he sent some of his formulas to a professor in Cambridge called Hardy. And Hardy saw them and he was amazed. He saw some of the work was truly original. And he invited Ramanujan to Cambridge to work with him. And Ramanujan went to Cambridge and he spent a year or two there, and he fell ill because that was during the war, the First World War, and he was a vegetarian, he never got proper food. And he came back, he got picked up tuberculosis, and he came back and he died a year later. But he did work which is well beyond his time. He did work on something called Mach theta functions, which gives the mathematical reasoning for black holes. And there was no theory for black holes in physics at that time. Some of the physicists who worked on black holes came later, like Oppenheimer, the famous American nuclear physicist, who was more famous for the atomic bomb. And before he died, Ramanujan said he used to pray to his family goddess Namgiri. And he says, Namgiri used to give me formulas in my sleep when I was dreaming. And I would wake up and I would write these formulas down. Now he didn't attribute anything to himself. He had that divine connect, and he got this information which was so ahead of his time to him, which he published. And now there's there's a movie on him. Patanjali talks about a few ways we can drop our karma. He says if you're conscious, if you're acting consciously and not compulsively, you don't pick up any karma. Service is another way where you don't pick up any karma. And then he makes a statement. He says there's a interconnectedness between the motive of an action and its consequence. When you realize this, your karma drops. So if your motive is pure, if it's not a selfish desire, it's not from the ego, you pick up no karma. And whatever actions you take, your karma dissolves. And he goes on to say that there's one thing left to do before you are enlightened. Samadhi is not enlightenment. You know, I read 7 translations of the Yoga Sutras before I started doing mine, and nobody explained whether Samadhi was enlightenment or not. And Patanjali, he doesn't say it's enlightenment. You're very close to liberation, but there's one more step. And that step is that if you get these powers, you do not misuse them. You do not use them for personal benefit. And then you reach a stage where you're enlightened. And at the end of the book, he gives another method, which is a very simple way to be enlightened or be close to enlightened. And he says, don't identify with the mind. He explains the mind is different from the soul, from the self as he calls it. And the mind is the ego. So he says, if you can keep a distance from your body mind, if you don't identify with this, then you're very close to liberation and all your suffering will end. So he gives a very easy method at the end, that if you're able to do this, if you don't identify with your body, then you're very, very close to liberation. And in our lives, when we identify with the body, we start identifying with many things. Our college education, the job we do, our stature in society, how much money we may have or not have, the car we drive, the house we live in. We start identifying with all those things. Now, when we're close to dying, we automatically drop that. And what Patanjali is saying is, drop it now, and you live a very, very happy life. Now, there's a shrine which we're going to show later. We're just going to show a few pictures later. There's a shrine when you go to Mount Kailash and you start the circumambulation of Mount Kailash. There's a small shrine. You start from a place called Yamdwar. It's 2 kilometers from a town called Darchin, and it's a very small shrine. And Yamdwar, basically, Yama is the god of death, and Dwar means the door or gates. So it literally means the gates to the door of to the god of death. And the symbolism of that shrine is that you are supposed to drop all your identities when you go there. When you pass through that and you're going to Kailash to meet Lord Shiva, you drop all those identities that you've taken, and you're just a piece of life. Your consciousness, your piece of life, your awareness, you're not any of the things you may have acquired or you thought you've acquired through your education. So they make you do that when you go on the trek to Kailash. There's a lot else in this book. Now I don't want to keep talking about it. I do want to keep this brief. There's so much that he has to say. It's difficult to bring it out all in a short speech. But he's an iconic figure of yoga. And normally when we end any yoga session, there's an invocation that is done. It's actually a chant from the Brihad Aranika Upanishad. And I'll give you its meaning. And the basic Sanskrit chant is Asato ma satgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityur ma amritam gamaya, om shanti shanti shanti. It means from the unreal, lead me to the real. From darkness, lead me to light. From death, lead me to immortality. Now, I'm going to close with that, and I think some of the other panelists will speak. And we're also going to show you some pictures because today is International Day of Yoga. And we want to show you few pictures and videos of some of the places where yoga started. yoga was taught by Lord Shiva in two places. Do you want to do the pictures now? Or would you like to do it? Uh, the first yoga lesson took place above Kedarnath in a lake called Kanti Sarovar, and it also took place in Mount Kailash on the south face. So there's just 6, 7 pictures and a couple of videos. It'll take 3, 4 minutes. I'll just show this to you. It was at Mount Kailash that this is a video of the north face of Mount Kailash. Now, it was at Mount Kailash that Lord Shiva first taught yoga to the 7 sages, the 7 Saptarishis. And when you do the first day of the parikrama, you come to Derapok and you come up a little. You come to this spot which is very close to the north face. And this just gives you an idea of what the surroundings are like. That's the opposite hill, and below you'll see a red Buddhist monastery. That's where we used to stay earlier, and there's small hutments across the river, which is normally where we stay. And that's the path that goes on. If you do the parikrama, you carry on down that way. That's the sound of the wind. It was very windy up there. This is a video of Mansarovar. It's only 26 kilometers from Kailash. It has celestial beings, so we never take water from Mansarovar. We have a dip there, but you never take water from there. It's a massive lake and it's stunningly beautiful. 15,000 feet above sea level, and it's crisp and clear. This is the rock of the Shiva Sutras. It's in a stream in Dachigam National Park, just outside Srinagar, half an hour drive. It's where the Shiva Sutras were inscribed. Lord Shiva had gone to, he appeared to Vasugupta in a dream and asked him to go to this rock. And when Vasugupta touched this rock, it turned over and on its face were inscribed the Shiva Sutras. Indira Gandhi used to meditate on this rock. It's in Dachigam National Park. You need approval to go there. This is another snapshot of the rock. They have the main guest house there, and then it's a short walk there. There's this beautiful stream. This is the north face of Kailash up close. You could literally go and touch it there. We didn't go and touch the Mount Kailash. We just kept a respectful distance. But I can't tell you the energy in this place. It's phenomenal. This is at sunrise. Just about captured a little of the sun. It's not a very good photo, but it's at sunrise in the morning, the north face. This is Mansarovar in the afternoon. It had a color, blue color. Sometimes it looks green, sometimes it looks brown. The color changes during the day. This is Mansarovar at sunrise. This is Kedarnath. This is a rock that, the first yoga lesson took place in a lake called Kanti Sarovar, which is just above Kedarnath. That's where Lord Shiva first taught the Saptarishis before teaching them in Kailash. And because of excessive rain, I think it was 2012 or 13, the banks of that lake collapsed and water came rushing down to Kedarnath, and a lot of people got swept away and they died. And there was this rock you see here which came tumbling down, and it stopped just in front of the Kedarnath Mandir, and it diverted the water into 2 flows. And standing there, visually it seemed like the rock was just about as wide as the temple. So it saved the temple, otherwise the temple would have gotten destroyed with the floods. This is a front photo of Kedarnath. Now, Kanti Sarovar was in those mountains somewhere, a small lake and a very beautiful lake, which is now no longer there, and that's where yoga was first taught. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the places that are where yoga began. Mount Kailash, Kedarnath. Since today is International Day of Yoga and we're discussing yoga. Thank you. That's what I have.
So, Anju, you have as I understand, as a Kashmiri Pandit, you have an understanding of the connections that are in the book and that Ranjit was talking about. Would you like
Um,
to would you like to talk a little bit about that connect?
I would love to. Thank you very much, Ranjit, for your in depth and very intense analysis of the book. I would say that I would very strongly associate and relate to the portions in the book which talk about Kashmir, the land of Rishi Kashyap, right? Um, Surprisingly, I mean, before I read the book, I didn't know Ranjit Chaudhri, and we got to know more of him because we recently had a play in Bengal Club. And it was very surprising that the places mentioned in the book were all the places that I'd been to, have been going through. This rock, which was a kind of a revelation for Vasugupta as per directions of Lord Shiva, has been there for a very long time. But honestly speaking, I had no idea about the cultural significance of the rock. We used to go and have picnics there, that kind of a thing. Then the other thing was Anubhav Gupta, another sage who reached a level of samadhi and attained. He reached a level which helped him attain Mahasamadhi. And because of that Mahasamadhi, he entered a cave and he disappeared with his 1200 disciples. And like mentioned in the book, one never got to know anything about what happened to them. So I am aware of that cave, except that we were not allowed to get into it because it was meant to be haunted and things like that. And again, we had no clue about what actually was the story behind it. Then the third is Lakshmanju, Swami Lakshmanju, who was a Shaivist expert with his ashram in Ishbar. So that I had interactions with because he passed away in 1991. That also, the author has mentioned very ably about his philosophy, Shaivism plus tantric science and things like that. So I very strongly associate, and also having said that, it's not an easy read. It's intense. It is not like reading pages about your twilight living and about your midlife crisis and things like that. It is a very serious thing to read, but the only thing is to absorb it and to sustain it is not it takes time. And the author very, very intelligently has broken it into bite-sized paragraphs which are easily digested and chewed and digested. And it also has an introductory line, which I thought was very helpful for novices like me because it needs a kind of a push for one to get into it, and that is the push he's given. Thank you.
Wonderful. So let's turn this to Harish, and then we could do a Robin with Choitali.
Well, I'd like to congratulate you on bringing the history of a lost, what was once lost form, and to continue to propagate it so that more and more people can get a grip of what really Kriya Yoga is. And I thought your book, although it's a slim book, you have 45 books you've consulted in the bibliography, which is pretty good. And I also was very happy to see Paramhans Yogananda's book is in your bibliography, plus people like Eckhart Tolle and so many other Western scholars of different forms of spirituality. Not just Kriya, but you have pulled together. You have pulled together in this book a sort of underpinning of experts in spirituality, and that has helped in some ways. And of course, very briefly, you pointed out that the Kriya Yoga, which is understood today, is different from what Kriya Yoga was in its initial years. And that is interesting. It's become sort of more focused on meditation now, but what my understanding of Kriya is that that it was lost for a very long time. That Patanjali's teachings themselves had undergone a period of obscurity, and then various important Indian sages uh, helped bring it out and popularize it. And Paramahansa Yogananda ji's um, self-realization fellowship, he began in the 1950s to take it abroad to America, where it's flourished, and it's all over the place. So that's it. I think I have. I congratulate you, and but of course, Kriya Yoga is a very personal business, and the path to Kriya Yoga is simple. It's a simpler path than the path of. Let's say that it's a simpler thing to do than to prepare for an examination. Kriya Yoga is simpler to achieve than to learn to play golf. To be you can be a better Kriya Yogi. Not joking. You can be a better Kriya Yogi than a good golfer or a good cricketer. So it's a simple thing, because you talked about the soul, and that the soul and the body must be kept at some kind of arm's length. But at the same time, it's this body that is the battlefield that you have to conquer. This is the body that you have to conquer in order to make sure that the soul that is progressing is a cleansed, that your makeup that you're going to take to your next life is cleansed as much as possible. And Kriya Yoga is one of the paths of doing that. And this is what I take away from you, what you're doing. And I think that's the important contribution you've made today with this book. Because you're telling us that don't miss the boat or the bus. This is the last one. The bell is ringing. It's time to go. Time to pick it up and change.
Thank you, Harish. As a Kriyaban, I'm quite impressed, I should say, that there is so much humility. Although you're a practitioner, and as is Ranjit, there's hope for us then.
Thank you, Julie, and congratulations, Ranjit. So, this is like a big surprise you brought out of your very taciturn box. And I like the way in which you have packaged a lot of information in very simple language. And I don't know who you targeted as your audience, but this is equally important for someone trying to learn or get an introduction to yoga, and as much as someone who's been practicing yoga for a long time. So it's extremely articulate and simply put, and although the Sanskrit verses are a line long or maximum 2 lines long, your explanations in English go into a page and more. So that tells us how concise and compressed and concentrated the sutra is, that it requires so much of English to explain it. And it's a book for easy reference. At any time you open any page and you get a nugget of wisdom out of it, and applicable, easy to assimilate. So yeah, I think this book is a very good modern documentation of yoga.
Wonderfully said. Thank you.
Nothing much to add after what the author himself and the other panelists have said about the book. I wanted to comment just about 2 things. Number one is, I think it's a big decision to do such a work with so much of background study in an age when we are just thinking of which mall to go to and where not to go to, how consumerist we will become, buy things and then feel guilty about it, and let's forget about it. How much we sort of really take the process of yoga into account is a big question. So it's a book which definitely makes one self of me look at another self of me. And this is where I think Ranjit has done a marvelous job. He has referred to the Gita time and time again. and especially he tries to talk about detachment. If we all remember, Krishna had told Arjun, Jat tapasya konteyo tat kurushva madarpanam. So do everything. When you have a strawberry ice cream, have it, but give it to me, finally. So that lesson of trying and uplifting yourself, I think that is what he does it beautifully. And the second point is his knowledge, his breadth of reading was very, very good. I'm just going to mention, Harish just now mentioned about Toll Eckhart, and I wanted to mention Paul Brunton and Neil Donald Walsh. These authors have been read in detail, who have contributed to the richness of this book. And salutes and congratulations to such an effort, Ranjit.
Before I turn this for the last word to the author, I'll leave you with a small, funny anecdote, which is, I think, so full of wisdom. It stood straight in my head for the last maybe 40 years. I first read Christopher Isherwood. How many of you in the room know that name? Christopher Isherwood? Just so many? Well, you know, he was a great follower of Sri Ramakrishna, and he was also known to Vivekananda. So he is in LA. Imagine him, Sri Vivekananda's ashram in LA of the mission, Ramakrishna mission. And the head there for that moment when Isherwood is there is a guy called Swami Prabhuvananda. So for the 3 days running, he comes home back to the ashram at 2 in the morning. And it's very well noted, Prabhuvananda's meditations began at that time in the morning. So on the 4th day, very sheepishly, Isherwood goes and knocks at his door. And so Swamiji says, yes, what is it, Chris? He used to love Christopher. He said, I have a question which has been bothering me for a long time. And this goes back to exactly what Choitali was saying about desire and the guilt and the anxiety that comes with it. How do you detach yourself? So he says, yes, tell me, what is your problem? So he says, Isherwood tells us, Swami, he was gay. He was gay as London town. So he goes and tells the Swami, Swamiji, what should I do? Is it wrong for me to have this great sexual attraction? And Isherwood was in his 20s at that time, young. And you know what Prabhupada said? Exactly this. As long as you give me some of that attention that you're giving that strawberry ice cream, I have no problem with it. But don't forget, what is your primal consciousness? And then slowly, if you try to create a space by giving me more attention, your consciousness more attention, you will find it easier to eject this love of the object, whether it's sex or whether it's food or whatever it is. So I thought that was, as Ranjit was speaking, as everyone here was speaking, I was thinking of Christopher Isherwood. Makes more sense for lay people like us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Hope you enjoyed that. Okay. So, if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. Quick ones and quick answers from the team. Yes, go ahead.
I may ask you a very childish question, then ignore it. I have not seen any photograph in your book. So how do I practice?
You see, for asanas and pranayamas, you need a teacher. It shouldn't be done without a teacher. It's not something that should be learned from a book, which is why Patanjali himself doesn't give specific asanas and pranayams, because if you do it incorrectly, some harm can come. So, especially if you're doing something advanced. So, a teacher is necessary for at least those two aspects. For anything else, no. If you're just meditating, concentrating, that's fine. You can concentrate on any object, you can chant the mantra Om, you can follow the 5 self-disciplines, the 5 observances, all that you can do. But asana, pranayama should be learned from a teacher.
Can you suggest any one or two books? No?
There are some good schools. You have the Bihar School of Yoga, you've got Isha Foundation. They all have centers in Calcutta. So you could look at that. I think Isha has something on Russell Street, very close by, Isha Yogashala. So,
Thank you.
right.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
The very simple question, because I'm a devotee of Ramakrishna Mission and Ramakrishna Thakur, and we were told before we took Dikha, read Swamiji's 4 yogas. Raj Yoga had lots to say. Started with Karma Yoga and then you move up to Raj Yoga. Now, I have a simple question which has baffled me, because neither Ramakrishna nor Vivekananda are in town. They've all gone. How would you describe the soul as an immortal being, if I can use that word, vis-a-vis the body when a person dies? How would you describe that?
How do you describe the soul as immortal? The soul is something that's not destructible. That's something that Lord Krishna said. And yes, we go as per assumption of what other people say till we experience it ourselves. It's only when you get to the level of full consciousness that you can really experience that for yourself, where it's not something like that is destroyed. Our body is something that passes away, and there are many texts on this. Ashtavakra Gita also describes it beautifully. We get scared of change, and Ashtavakra says, all things arise, experience, change, and pass away. When you understand this, you remain peaceful. But the soul is. Sorry?
No, I was trying to say that death is actually just physical.
Right.
Right, but the body is still alive, They say, according to medicine, when we pronounce death, it's actually still alive for some time. Your brain is very active, even after death. These kind of thematic understandings of human existence really baffles sometimes, because we are so concerned about the loss, personal loss of the person to ourselves, that we don't care to think, is he really dead? His brain is active. If you open up a dead man's brain, I believe it'll answer many questions.
They have actually opened up a dead man's brain and several dead men's brains, Prof. Because there's a book that we've read recently, 10 minutes and 38 seconds. It's by Eli Shafak, and it led me on to read a fantastic book, which I think many of you who have this question, Life After Death, and it's by Swami Agehananda. Yeah. And he's a Ramakrishna, a follower of the Ramakrishna fold. What is interesting is Ramakrishna himself used to joke and say, you will only realize that your body is gone, finished, when you're taken to the crematorium. তার আগে বুঝবি না, যখন ওইখানে যাবি তখন বুঝবি যে তোর আত্মাটা তোর সাথে যাবে, তুই তোর আত্মার সঙ্গে যাবি. But he never ever, he always made light of the most difficult concepts.
Thank you, Julie. The soul is very interesting, I think. If I was asked one thing, what do you find most interesting about a person or human existence, I would say soul, because it raises so many doubts, so many questions, and we say the moment we die, we enter into another body, right? And then how does the chapter roll on from there? What about that soul and this soul? You can go on asking so many questions.
I think there are there are books that say that there is a soul and there is a, but when you read such a book, it seems cold and clinical. But this is something I think to be experienced. I mean, you have to intuitively feel that there is a soul inside you. And
Have you felt it? Have you felt it?
Yeah, if you do certain kinds of yoga,
You felt your soul.
you will feel a larger presence. You will feel the body dissolving into something bigger. You will feel the entire spectacular dream. But if you read it in a book, it will never explain itself, because it will just be a bunch of facts. And then you may not believe them. So the only way to experience the soul is yourself. And I think that's what Patanjali is all about.
I think what he mentions at the very beginning is the essence of human life, self-discipline, you know. Unless you discipline yourself, you don't attain anything in life. You know, that's a basic human feature, I think. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Okay, so Ranjit, thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.